All right, hello everyone. Instructor Hannah back. You guys know the drill at this point. This is a pre-recorded lecture based off of Preble's art forms, also taking some inspiration from my cohort Erica Lewis, who's linked in the description. Today, I think that this lecture might be a little bit long, so go ahead and grab a snack, make some tea, and remember that this is a video, so if you feel your attention span starting to fade, you can always pause it and take a break and come back. You could even pause it between chapter 8 and chapter 9. So anyway, let's get into it. Chapter 8 is on printmaking. So prints, to define them, it's one piece of art of a series of nearly identical pieces, usually printed on paper. And they're among the more accessible art forms in terms of being able to buy them. They're usually lower prices, and they are able to be distributed more widely because there's multiples of each art piece. And here's an example of a print. This is Quiver by Tanja Softik. And this involves the layering of images. Each layer is printed with its own color, so she had to go back and pull the ink over the screen, which we'll talk about that process later. Well, actually, it's a lithograph, not a screen. But anyway, she had to pull the ink over it for every different color. So each color was put on manually one at a time. And this piece is a meditation on fragile structures and relates to the process of memory. And the artist has said that she makes visual poems with her work. So, what are prints? Some of us might not be as familiar with these terms in here, and I'm gonna throw a bunch of terms at you all at once. So just remember, you can take notes. The tests are open book, open note, so you can come back to this, screenshot the video, write it down in your notebook, but there's just going to be a bunch of terms that you might not know yet. So prints are an artwork that exists in multiple copies. It's made from what is called a matrix. That's like in mold making, the mother mold that everything else is made off of. In printmaking, this is called the matrix. And that's usually created from metal, wood, or stone. Prints come in editions, which are groups of images made from the same matrix. And oftentimes they're numbered, and that the numbering, like in the bottom right-hand corner, indicates the sequence of pulled prints. So basically you're proving that there's only this many of these prints in the world, because it's like, if it's an edition of 30 prints, then someone bought number 6 out of 30, and they can prove that there's not another number 6 out of 30 anywhere in the world, and it kind of helps to maintain the value for art collectors. Also, they are made, the sort of practicing making the prints up until you get exactly what you want, that's called proofs. It's working through progressive proofs. And an artist's proof, also abbreviated to AP, is like when it's not the finished product, but it's satisfactory enough to the artist that they're willing to sell it as an artist's proof. So instead of being like 1 out of 30 or 2 out of 30, it'll be like artist's proof instead. It'll say AP in the corner. Now, printing pictures was developed in China in the 9th century, and by the 11th century, they found a way to make movable type, so being able to rearrange letters, and basically this led into the printing press, which is how we were able to print books. Printmaking developed in Europe later in the 15th century, and there was a lot of demand for inexpensive religious icons and playing cards, so people just wanted a way to have an image of whatever god they worship or whatever saint they're into at the moment or something, or having playing cards, things like that. And it was too expensive to have everything have to be an original painting or drawing, but a lot cheaper for it to be able to be prints. Also, with the invention of the printing press, we moved from just printing books with movable type to illustrating books with movable type. So adding illustrations to books is another step of this kind of evolution of prints. There are some different reasons to make prints. So prints are less expensive than paintings or sculpture, so they can be purchased by a wider group of viewers. If you think about it, if you sell someone a painting or a sculpture, that's the only one of that you have. You can never sell it again, so it has to be more expensive. So people who want to support artists but aren't rich can't really afford that. But people who want to support artists but aren't rich can usually afford prints instead, because they'll be at much less of a price because you could make 100 of them, 500 of them. So that is a way that artists are able to make work for an audience that might not be able to afford to collect originals. And also it's a good way to support artists if you want to start an art collection at a young age. You know, the best way to support artists is to give us your money, because Lord knows we have none. So collecting prints is a good way to get started with that if you're interested. Also, another reason to make prints is that it's an easy way to influence social change, because you can distribute it more widely in comparison to unique works of art where there's only one of these paintings and it's on a wall in a gallery or a museum and only the people that happen to go there can see it. Instead, prints could be like posters that are wheat pasted everywhere, so you could really widely spread an idea through this. Also, another reason to make prints is just some people are very fascinated with the printing process itself and the craft. It is definitely an art form in and of itself, so some people just really like that aspect of it. So let's get into different types of prints and how they're made. A kind of broad term for a bunch of different types of prints we're going to be talking about is relief prints. And that is basically when what is not going to be printed is cut away, and what is left and not cut away is called the relief, and that is what the ink sits on. You can see an example of this in fingerprints, rubber stamps, the marks that wet tires leave on the pavement. Basically, the artist creates a matrix by cutting away. In this image, the example is wood, so they've chiseled away this wood and cut it away. And then all of the parts that are erased that would have the ink on them, that is called the relief, that is in relief. And the tools that artists usually use for this are gouges, knives, and chisels. It can become a very physical process. Now, this example is of a woodcut print specifically, so let's talk about what a woodcut print is. They're called woodcuts, or wood blocks is what the actual block of wood that you make the print with is called. And it tends to lend itself to bold black and white contrast. You can really have a limited, you can't have like lots and lots of tones of gray unless you're willing to carve every part of where you want the different tone of gray to be, or I shouldn't be saying tone, value, different values of gray. Goodness, I should not be misusing these words if I'm the instructor. Anyway, different values of gray, for every different value you'd have to carve a different wood block. So usually people just do bold black and white prints with woodcut. It doesn't lend itself easily to color for the same purpose. You could do like 2 colors, but you'd have to carve 2 different pieces of wood for it. But if you wanted to do 16 different colors, you'd have to carve 16 different pieces of wood and make sure that they all match up, and that's just really hard to do. So it's not really good for the woodcut process. Also, the prints that are made of woodcuts are usually limited to a couple hundred editions. It can't be in the thousands or anything, because the relief edges will deteriorate over time as they're printed. Here is an example of a woodcut print, and you can see that a lot went into this because of how many different colors and how many different values of gray there are. Each one of those had to be carved in a separate block of wood and lined up on each other. But woodcuts especially flourished in Japan from the 17th to 19th centuries. As you can see here, this is an example of a Japanese woodcut. And like I said before, they would use multiple wood blocks to achieve subtle and highly integrated color effects. This took a lot of time and care. And it was actually the preferred method for middle-class artists because it's a bit more accessible than other forms of art making, although it does take a lot of time to make something this detailed with this many colors and this many values. The subject matter from Japanese woodcut prints can range from famous theater actors, landscapes, and also erotic images. Japan has a very interesting history of erotica where some of it was actually like government funded because there was like a dip in like birth rates, but that's beside the point. Also, I don't even know if I'm allowed to include this. Hokusai, we talked about him in a previous lecture, most famous for his painting The Great Wave. Hokusai invented tentacle porn. I'm not sure if that's totally off topic, but you know, I guess you can let me know what you think of it in class, and then I'll know that you actually watched the video. Okay, but anyway, moving on. This example is Light Rain at Shono by Hiroshige, and this is a color woodcut. So like I said earlier, multiple wood blocks would have to be carefully aligned, and in printmaking, the term that we use for that is registered. So if you print different colors, like if you're printing the light yellow here and then the blue afterwards, and you don't line it up perfectly, everything's going to be like weirdly shifted to the side, and like the colors just won't line up and it'll be odd. So people use mechanisms to help them register their matrix like more precisely. But it's if you thought it was hard to have to carve all the different matrices. I am off the walls in this one. I'm gonna calm down. Okay. If you thought that it was hard to carve all of the different ones, it's even harder to line them up. So it really takes a ton of skill. Moving on. Here's another example. This is by Ernest Ludwig Kirchner, and this is Port Scene. And this print shows a lot of roughness. The image is almost indecipherable because of just how obscured everything is from the roughness of the medium. I mean, if you look, you can kind of start to see figures in the foreground and sailboats in the background, in case you needed a verbal cue as to what you're looking at here. But the texture of the matrix is obvious. You can see some of the grain of the wood in the ink. And Kirchner's approach was direct and expressive, and it was intentionally like this as a revolt against the super polished effects that everyone was seeking out by other European printmakers at the time. So this is kind of like intentionally being what everyone doesn't want you to do. And some people could say, oh, it's just from a lack of skill, but I think whenever an artist is able to demonstrate that they have enough skill to do it the right way and that they're intentionally doing it the other way, then they're clearly making a point with that. Now let's talk about wood engraving, which is traditionally used for book illustration. And for wood engraving, you use a very dense piece of wood set on its end. And because of it being a dense piece of wood, having more wood behind it than the woodcut pieces of wood normally have, it'll be more durable. So you're able to print in larger editions, which is great if you're trying to publish like 5,000 books and they need to all have these prints on them. Also, people would use metal tools to help them more easily engrave onto the surface of the wood. And that gave them a little bit more control over their lines and not have to like really wrestle with a chisel the whole time. This example is Boy Returning Joyfully with Plow and Oxen by William Blake. William Blake was an early pioneer of this style and used the highest detail possible from having different engraving tools at really fine sizes and using different sizes for different areas. You can see some areas have thicker lines, but moving down into more and more delicate styles and sizes with his engraving tools. Now let's talk about Lino Cuts, which is short for linoleum cut. That is when someone makes prints by gouging a synthetic linoleum surface in the areas that they don't want to take ink. So this basically functions as a soft matrix, and it has no grain to it like wood. So because of that, it can be cut with equal ease in any direction. With wood, if you're cutting against the grain, it's harder to like chisel that out. Also, it's just way easier to do. Like, it's just a softer surface to make your gouges on, so it requires less muscle and less like really sweating over it. So it's preferred. It can be a little bit more expensive because linoleum is more expensive than wood, but definitely a lot more beginner friendly. This example is from Elizabeth Catlett, and this is called I Have Special Reservations. And you can see that the special reservations that this figure has, I think it's a rather androgynous figure. I'm not sure if it's meant to be a man or a woman. But they are in the colored only section of the bus, and apparently they have special reservations to go to the colored only section of a restaurant. And so this is definitely talking about segregation. And this is from an artist of color, an African-American artist as well. So clearly they're talking about their own experiences and their experiences of their friends and loved ones. And also this was made in 1946. That is an important thing to note for the time period of segregation that this artist was experiencing and commenting on. And the artist used even white gouges in this and was very socially conscious in her form of printmaking and used very dignified images of African Americans. All of them seem to have a dignified look on their face. No one is like degraded. Well, I mean, it is degrading to be in a colored only section, but the facial expressions, I feel, kind of show a sense of, I don't want to just say the word dignity again, humility, yet graceful, inherent power. Also, I think that the fact that this is a process that relies on, specifically for this, unless she were to use lots of different matrices, this really does rely on stark contrast between black and white. So she's literally using the inherent qualities of the medium of printmaking to make commentary on stark differences between the way black and white people are treated in America. Now let's look at some kind of unconventional printmaking methods and printmakers. This is Betsy Romero. I'm just going to say Romero. Romero is a contemporary artist of Mexico City and actually buys used tires with eroded shreds and carves relief patterns into the tires themselves. This is more cost effective, but also adds this whole layer of background story to each piece. And the subject matter of the patterns carved onto the tires are based on traditional Mexican pop culture motifs, such as skeletons and flowers, like in Los Dios de Muertos and things like that. And also the way that the tires are able to roll, it's easily inked to be printed on long sheets, like you can see on this example in the left. You can literally roll the tire down a very long sheet of paper, and they're displayed in creative ways like this. They're either sold by the yard, almost like one would be buying fabric at a fabric store, or they can be exhibited together with the tires that made them, like in this example on the left. Now let's talk about intaglio prints. Intaglio prints are kind of the opposite of relief prints in a way. The areas below the surface are what holds the ink. So it's not the parts in relief that hold the ink, but instead the parts that you carve down are the parts. It comes from the Italian word intagliare, which means to cut into, because the parts that you cut into are the parts that hold the ink. So the process is that ink is dabbed on the entire surface, but then the surface is wiped clean except for in the grooves. So you can imagine wiping just the top layer would remove the ink from the top layer while still leaving it in the grooves pretty easily. And then people use damp paper specifically so that it can take it better, and it's passed beneath a press roller, and that roller pushes it down and makes it able to accept the ink, and the dampness of the paper also makes it more able to accept the ink. And also, you can tell that something is an intaglio print because there will be characteristic plate marks of the roller where you can actually see where all of the, like there's a physical texture to the print because you can see, it's almost like something being engraved or embossed. You can see where the paper was kind of shoved down into those crevices a little bit, and it holds that shape on a slightly three-dimensional level too. Another example of intaglio printing is engraving. That is when an artist uses a burin, which is a special engraving tool, on a metal plate. And that takes strength and control because they have to literally dig out metal. They use a scraper to smooth down rough edges of the groove so that there's no kind of burrs on the edges and stuff because of the metal being all dug up. And the lines are not able to be freely drawn due to the pressure that you need to use and just how much you can imagine. What's a good example for this? Like trying to draw with a pencil taped to the end of a baseball bat instead of drawing with just your regular pencil. Like it's harder. You have to use more force. It's weird. And so you're not able to have as much control. This is the style used in United States currency, like on the $1 bill and all of the other dollar bills. And also, this example from Albrecht Dürer is so impressive, knowing that it's in engraving, in which he had to use all of that physical force to do, because look at how incredibly complex and detailed this is. Oh my word. Dürer is a very famous printmaker and also just image maker in general. And he was also one of the first people to really popularize signing your work on the actual piece itself. In this image, in the bottom left-hand corner, you can kind of see he has this little like sign with a sort of sigil on it that has like a large A and a small D inside of the large A, and that was his way of signing his work. But I mean, he has every right to be proud and want everyone to know that that's his, because just imagine how much skill it took to do this. It's insane. Now let's talk a little bit about intaglio prints. And a good, most common example of intaglio printing is dry point prints. It's similar to line engraving, but a little bit different. You use a tool with steel or a diamond tip and a soft copper or zinc plate. And when you make all of the etchings, the displaced metal leaves burr, which is a rough edge. So if you've ever like cut metal in the metal shop and there's this really rough edge that's called a burr that you have to grind off, otherwise it'll like cut your fingers or something. It's just all of that displaced metal sits on top. And instead of being wiped away or ground down, the burr is intentionally left there, and it creates a sort of blurred line when you make the prints. Dry point prints are usually done in small editions. They're rarely done. It's just very complicated and just harder to do. But a lot of people will use them to fill in details of etchings that are otherwise not dry point etchings, but they'll do a few layers of dry point in some areas just to make certain details have like a sort of fuzzier, more blurred line to them. So here is an example that incorporates etching, engraving, and dry point. So in some of the areas where the lines are more hazy and blurred, that would be an example of dry point where they left all of those rough metal burrs on the surface of their matrix. Excuse me. So for etching, this is when you take a preparation of a metal plate, so copper or zinc, and you put a wax or varnish over it, and then you will draw through the surface of the wax or varnish to expose the metal. And then you take that metal plate and you immerse it in nitric acid that makes a groove according to either the strength of the acid or the amount of time that the plate is left in the acid bath. So basically everywhere that you left exposed, the metal exposed, everywhere that you carved away that amount of wax or varnish is where the acid eats away a little bit at the plate. In this style, the lines generally end up looking more relaxed and more irregular than engraved lines, and that's because you're really only having to use your strength to push away wax, which is a lot easier to do than actually carving into the metal itself. So that is one way that some people get around that and make it a bit easier. However, some of the chemicals can be a bit toxic, especially if you don't use them correctly. But this example is by Rembrandt, and this is Christ preaching. So you can see Jesus in the middle there. And you can compare it to the Albrecht Dürer that we looked at earlier and his extremely precise lines. These are a lot more loose and free-flowing, and you can see that there's just a more relaxed state of mark making in the artist because of the, ability to make marks without having to really use your muscles. Also, there is a very skillful use of light and shadow that you can see in this piece, but it's definitely provided by the medium of etching, and specifically dry point. Being able to make these blurred lines makes you able to really emphasize subtle differences in value. So here is another example of etching, but with a different technique added. This is Aquatin. Aquatin is a technique of sprinkling acid-resistant powder over areas that you need a slight gray tone to, and you're able to make varying values on one plate instead of having to make separate plates for every different value of gray that you want to use. And in this example, Aquatin is combined with other techniques. Dry point is also used here, and this is Mary Cassatt's The Letter. Today, people use electro-etching and kind of have machines to do this for them to avoid endangering the artist's health from the acids, because it can, especially if you make your whole art career around this and you're working with these acids every day, it really can deteriorate your health. So people have found ways to make machines do that part for them. So now let's talk a bit about lithography. Lithography is a surface or planographic printing process, and this basically just means that it's more of a flat plane of a surface used to do the printing, and it is a faster and more flexible method to print. So the process behind this is that an artist draws an image on Bavarian limestone or on a different type of plate, but usually Bavarian limestone, without cutting the image. And then the artist will use litho crayons, that's why it's called lithography, or pencils, or touche liquid, but mainly litho crayons because that's quite literally what it's named after. And they complete the image and treat it with gum arabic, which is actually, if you remember from the painting lecture, that is the binder that holds together watercolor paints. So it is like a pigment binder. And then they dampen the surface with water and ink it. And because the surface remains intact, lithographic stones or plates can be reused. So basically you're not carving into it or anything. That's why it's planographic. It's a flat surface. You're just adding pigment on top of it. And this provided ease of printing in the early 1800s. It is harder to make multiple prints of this. Usually you can only make one, which is called a monoprint. And then sometimes if you're lucky, you can make a ghost print afterwards, where it's kind of like a lighter, softer version of it. And those are seen as kind of like an artist proof, like it's like a cool thing to have from behind the scenes, but it's not the piece itself. But yeah, it is a lot faster and easier, but it's also, harder to make multiples with. So here is an example of lithography by Honore Damier, and he was one of the first lithographic artists, one of the first people to really popularize this. This piece is called Rue Transnonain. Yeah, Rue Transnonain, April 15th, 1834. That's in the title of the piece. That's not the date it was made, although it was made in 1834. So, it could have been made on April 15th. We don't know. But it captures the event of militia killings of many innocent tenants of an apartment. So this was a reaction to something violent and political happening within the vicinity of the artist, and he quickly made a lithograph print of it. And you can see how he was able to make that a lot faster than he would have been able to make something where he had to etch or engrave or even especially dry point. But all of these things, lithograph was way faster to use. And because of this, the print was actually published the day after the event. So it was able to go like in the newspapers and things like that. So that is one way that artists are able to make these images a lot faster and be able to make things that are quite reactionary to what's happening in the world around them and be able to get that image out quickly. All right, moving on, here are two examples of some prints from a very famous artist and printmaker, Toulouse-Lautrec. Toulouse-Lautrec often did prints from life, so when I say from life, it means they're not looking at a picture, they're actually looking at the person in front of them and working on that print design right there. Toulouse-Lautrec made hundreds of innovative works and really worked with a lot of bright colors and flattened compositions instead of trying to create really subtle variations in value to create light and shadow. It's a very stylized, flattened look, and pioneered this new style of the lithographic poster, which became very popular mainly because of Toulouse-Lautrec. And these posters were large format, and they were also very innovative compositions in terms of them breaking the sort of art rules of the day of trying to be super realistic. Everything was very stylized and illustrative in that way. Now, another example of ways that people use printmaking techniques, sort of, is stenciling. And this is very popular with street artists. A stencil is just a sheet with a design cut out of it. And when you paint over the stencil, it transfers the design to the picture plane underneath. And then you remove the stencil and voila, there's your design. It's an easy way to make multiple works of art. And it is definitely favored by street artists because you can make your composition ahead of time and not have to be like out there on the street doing something illegal for a long period of time. So the less amount of time that you have to be out there making the art, the better when it comes to street art. However, with stenciling, you're not able to do any shading. It's really just a black and white or like whatever color you choose in white type of scenario. Similar to the like black and white look of woodcuts, but you just really, you can't layer you can layer a whole bunch of stencils over each other, but it's just not common. This example is Urban Buddha by Kim McCarthy. And in the background especially, you can see she really demonstrates the use of subtle repeated patterns. So in this case, she did use multiple stencils over top of each other. And she used that to get this sort of overlapping look of the patterns behind. Now, the last printmaking process that we're going to talk about is screen printing. Screen printing is also known as silkscreen or serigraphy. And it's called this because it was traditionally, silk was used as the material to do this. What you do for screen printing is you adhere a stencil to a screen, and you take a rubber-edged blade. Well, oftentimes people will use a chemical process to burn away what is not on the stencil, so you don't actually have to squeegee the ink through the stencil. It's like burned away using a chemical process, although I suppose you could just like leave your stencil on top and it would catch the ink as well. But you use a rubber-edged blade or squeegee and you push ink through the fabric in the areas that are open. So it will go through on some parts and not on others, and that's how you control what the design is. And this is very good for producing uniform color, and also it's quite popular because you can screen print on pretty much anything that you're able to lay flat enough for the design. So this is how people make t-shirts, or some people screen print posters. Here's an example of a screen printed poster. Also in screen printing, there's no reversal of the image. like in other printmaking processes, if there's words in them, everything will be like you're looking at them through a mirror. In screen printing, you don't have to worry about that. So because of this, and also just because of its ease of access, it lends itself to poster production. So many social movements use silkscreen to help spread the word because it's just so easy to make multiple posters and spread them easily. Like how I was saying earlier, it's easier to spread something on a more wide plane to a more broad group of people with printmaking, and screen printing is especially known for this. This example is by Jesus Barraza. This is a Latino-American artist, and this piece is called We Are Fighting. And it's a portrait of the activist Milan Loic and a quote from one of her essays. And it is an excellent example of silkscreen. And like in the other processes, every different color that is used in this was pulled through a different screen. So I might be wrong, but this image looks to have 5 different colors. That means that 5 different screens were used to pull the ink through. And here is another example of screen printing. You can do something called a photo screen, which is one of the most recent developments in screen printing and printing in general. And you can use light-sensitive gelatin to screen fabric and basically put the image of a photograph onto the screen and screen print that photograph. Someone who did this a lot was Andy Warhol. Here is an example of Andy Warhol doing photo screen printing, and this is called Gangster Funeral because it's literally a photograph of a funeral of a famous gangster. And the variations in the different images here are caused by the varying amount of ink that he used and also by how hard he pushed the squeegee as he went along. Now, real quick before we move on, I just want to talk a little bit about some like unconventional methods of printmaking, some contemporary approaches, one might say. So more artists are taking on new technologies and moving printmaking into the 3rd dimension. And a good example of that is Michelle Murillo, who actually, these pieces are made of sandblasted glass. It's a process similar to silk screening to embed the image onto the surface of, in this case, blue glass. But basically, you paint a resist on the glass and then sandblast everything around the resist and then take it out of the sandblaster, pull the resist up, and then where you place the resist, the glass is like super smooth and clear, and the way it looked before you sandblasted it, and everywhere else it's got this rough sandblasted texture. This piece specifically work highlights the frequent ocean crossing migrations of local wildlife in the ocean. So yeah, there's that. And then also I quickly wanted to touch on 3D printing. In 3D printing, an artist creates a design using a digital modeling software. It's not actually a print in the sense of printmaking because a 3D print is not an impression left from like either relief or non-relief based styles of printing, but it is something that can come in a limited edition that's made by an artist. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that. All right, now let's get into chapter 9, which is on photography. Feel free to pause this and take a break if you need to. I'll still be here when you get back. But let's first talk about the invention of the camera. So the first camera ever invented was the camera obscura. And camera obscura literally means dark room in Latin. Camera means room and obscura means dark. And this was because you would literally use a dark room with a pinhole in it that sees the sunlight outside. And the only light that can come into the room is through that pinhole. So basically, reflected sunlight passing through the small hole shows an inverted image of what's outside on the wall inside. Some people developed a lens and angled mirror for tracing to make it easier, which you can see in this bottom image. But yeah, it basically just starts with a pinhole reflecting light and people tracing it and then flipping it upside down, and voila. Then people found ways to make chemical developments for photographs. In 1826, the first vague photographic image was made by Niepce. Honestly, I have no idea how to pronounce that. But it was made of a sensitized pewter plate that was exposed to light for 8 hours. Now, the most widely recognized first form of film printed photograph, instead of just tracing something from a camera obscura, is the daguerreotype. And this was invented by Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre, and that's why it's called the daguerreotype. And it was really the first type of camera that anyone else could get their hands on to use. So the way a daguerreotype works is it's an iodized silver plate that's exposed to mercury vapor, then fixed by a mineral salt solution. Here's an example of a daguerreotype from Daguerre himself. And also, this was a long exposure, so only stationary objects were able to be recorded. And you can see that in this. Plenty of people were walking up and down the street, but because it was such a long exposure, it would take an image over a long period of time. The only people that you can see in this are a man getting his shoe shined because he was staying still long enough for the camera to be able to register him. Other people just kind of show up as weird wisps, and they're really, you can't tell what they are. But yeah, that is the daguerreotype. Now let's look at a modern camera and the parts of it and how it works, basically. It resembles a traditional camera obscura, but it's a little bit more advanced, obviously. The lens collects light, and the image sensor collects the image that is upside down. And then that sensor converts the light into an electric charge. And that's how the image is recorded. And then it's just flipped to be not upside down when it's like presented to anyone, basically. There are 3 important adjustments that a photographer can make on their camera to change the way that their photo turns out. One is the focal length, which is the distance between the lens itself and the sensor, and that will change where the focus is on the camera. The aperture, which is measured in f-stops, and that is the ratio of focal length to the size of the opening. And then the shutter speed, which determines the brightness of the resulting photo. You know how I said earlier how things were long exposure? Well, images can be shorter or longer exposures, and the shutter speed is what controls that. So if it's a super quick shutter speed, then you'd be able to capture an action shot and not get everything super blurry. But if it's a very long shutter speed, you could even slow it down to be hours, then you could really get some just very rich, detailed senses of light and shadow that you wouldn't be able to get with the shorter shutter speed. So now let's look at some photography. We'll start with some early on photography. The public was initially pretty reluctant to accept photography as an art form. They thought that you weren't an artist if you were reliant on a mechanical device. Nowadays, it's pretty widely regarded that photography is an art form, although it is a bit watered down because everyone has a camera in their pocket now. But it is definitely considered an art form. Portrait photography, in particular, when photography was first invented, was in very high demand because people wanted a way to record the images of their loved ones, and only extremely rich people could pay to have a portraiture artist like sit down and paint a portrait. So it was very in high demand to just get photo portraits taken of yourself or your loved ones to remember them by. This example of portrait photography is by Julia Margaret Cameron, and she posed the children off-center, which was at first not really something that anyone did, and then people started realizing that you can play with composition and not everything has to be centered, and that can actually be a cool element to it. This piece is called Paul and Virginia, which is actually a reference to characters from a popular novel at the time. Now, another early crusader of photography and it being seen as an art form was Alfred Stieglitz. He opened up a photography gallery in New York City in 1905. He made the magazine Camera Work and published photography alongside art essays. And also his photography showed influence from paintings, which you can see here in Spring Showers, New York. There's definitely some influence from paintings, and also I can see some influence from printmaking as well in this one. Another early photographer was Henri CartierBresson. This is Place de l'Europe behind the Gare Saint-Lazare, Paris. And in it, you can really see the idea of an action shot, capturing that moment. And also, if you look closely, you can see there's parallelism between this man jumping and the dancer in the poster behind him. And the way that they're placed on the composition makes them kind of balance each other out. Also, like I said about the action shot, CartierBresson was very well known for capturing decisive moments in his work. Another example of early photography is this piece by Manuel Alvarez Bravo, Two Pairs of Legs. And this actually combines the image on a billboard with the building that is behind it. And you also might notice that there is some special attention played to the shadows for this piece. And the shadows really affect the legs underneath them. Now getting into some sort of experimental photography, Man Ray invented the idea of a rayograph. You can tell a lot of people like to name things after themselves. And that is made by placing objects on light-sensitive paper and exposing them to sunlight. So they're not really photographs. There's no cameras or lenses used here. And because of that, the subjects are sometimes pretty unclear. It's literally recording the shadows that the objects placed on the light-sensitive paper cast onto the paper. And with that, let's get into color photography. Photography was all black and white for the first 100 years of the art form. There were lots of technical problems that persisted through the 20th century in trying to find ways to make color be an option. The development for color photography, no pun intended, began in 1907, and it improved in 1932 with Eastman Kodak Company's color film. Now, that is probably a pretty familiar company name to you. And there was disdain for use of color photography in art throughout the 1960s because people actually thought that it was like small leagues. Like, it was normally associated with taking family photos. So people pretty much just thought that it wouldn't be considered fine art if it was color photography. Clearly, that idea has gone away, but that was something that people thought at first. Here is an example of an early on color photography work of art. This is by William Eggleston, and it was exhibited in color at the MoMA in 1976. This comes from Los Alamos Portfolio, which is a series of photographs that are basically just elegant compositions of everyday things. And this specific photograph is untitled, but is called Nehi Bottle on Car Hood. And looking at it, you can see the skillful arrangement of off-balance diagonals, and also it evokes a specific setting. It definitely has this Americana 1950s feeling to it, even though it's from 1976. Now, one of the most important things to think about when we think about photography is how photography has been implemented for social change. Photographers can be considered witnesses of their generation, and they record what happens around them to be preserved for future generations to look at. Visual statements of photography were more believable than any other medium because you really can't make it up if it's a photo. It had to be there in front of you. And this lends itself to documentation, to bringing awareness of events that people needed to know about. So here is an example of that. This is by Jacob Riis. He was an early leader of photography for social change, and this particular piece is called 5 Cents a Spot. And it drew attention to squalid living conditions and poverty. And actually, this photo ended up leading to improving housing and work safety by bringing more awareness to the subject. And the vividness of the photo was made possible by the recent invention of flash photography. So this was one of the first flash photos as well. Another example of photography for social change is this photo by Margaret Bourke-White. People consider photography to be a vehicle of truth. They say the camera never lies. Now, that might be changing now, which we'll get into later, but at the time, it truly was something that you just can't lie about. You could crop something, but that's about it. It had to truly be there in front of you for you to take a photo of it. Margaret Bourke-White really worked with the idea of a photographic essay, so taking several photos that all work on a theme together, a collection of photographs on a single subject, and they're arranged together to tell a story or convey a mood. This image in particular is of predominantly a group of African Americans that are all lined up because they are trying to access help after a flood. And the irony here, you can clearly see, is they're all standing in front of a giant billboard of a happy little white family that says there's no way like the American way and world's highest standard of living. So there's just definitely some irony in where the resources get divvied out to here, and clearly Bourke-White was thinking about this when she took the photo. Another thing that photographers will often call attention to is environmentalism in their photos. A very famous landscape photographer is Ansel Adams, and Ansel Adams in particular really showed everyone that there was a need for conservation of the natural environment by showing these great, breathtaking, beautiful landscapes and being like, look how important it is for us to protect this. This particular piece is Clearing Winter Storm, Yosemite National Park, California, and it definitely deals with the grandeur of nature and symbols of spiritual life transcending the conflicts of society. I think one thing that a lot of people overlook with this is Ansel Adams really didn't mention anything about this land having been stolen, but, maybe that's just something that we should start talking about now. Anyway, nowadays, today's environmental photographers are less likely to show the beauty of landscape and more likely to focus on the ugliness of human impact on the landscape. So this example is by Chris Steele Perkins, who traveled to the Marshall Islands where rising sea levels threatened to swallow the island entirely. This piece is called Marshall Islands, and in it you can see a makeshift seawall made of trash, which was basically just a desperate attempt to hold back the rising tides using just all of the litter that is laying around. It's kind of devastating if you think about it. And Steele Perkins also collaborated on a book and exhibition called North, South, East, West about climate change, and used this as well as the other photos in his series in order to make that and bring those ideas to the public, to light, and make it really real for people to see what's in front of them. Now, let's look at some people who push the limits of photography, who get a little experimental. Artists sometimes explore techniques to go beyond what we consider the limits of photography. So here is a photo by Susan Derges, and she lays sheets of photosensitive paper on the bottom of shallow ponds at night. And then when light shines on the paper through the surrounding bushes, it comes through the water, and it's like shown on the photosensitive paper, like the parts that receive the light end up developing and the parts that don't, and then you get this. So it really emphasizes shadows, and it also creates these otherworldly landscapes looking up from below the water's surface. This one in particular is called Gibbous Moon Cloud. Another artist that kind of pushes the limits of photography is Trevor Peglin, who highlights contemporary questions about government secrecy through his photography. So in this series, Limit Telephotography, he got as close as he possibly could to a secret government installation, as close as he was legally allowed to, and zoomed as much as he could. And the results are blurry, but they're still better than the naked eye. So this is something that the government doesn't want us to see. Now, you can't tell what it is, but the fact that it exists in an image means something. This is another photographer that pushes the limits of photography. This is Binh Dan. I hope I'm saying that right. This is a Vietnamese artist who recorded photographs onto plant material by actually putting negatives over the plants and then exposing them to sunlight, and then the parts that were exposed to sunlight through the negative yellowed and became dull over time, and the chlorophyll was preserved on the parts where the negative was dark, so he's able to print these images onto the leaves themselves. And the images that he chooses to print are images of victims of warfare in Southeast Asia. This particular one is called Iridescence of Life number 7, and it's featured in the Genocide Museum in Cambodia, which is, pretty bleak, but also very, very important to remember and never allow ourselves to forget that. So I think it's very important that there is a museum dedicated to that. And this work seems very fragile, yet precious and beautiful. And I think, in a way, he's talking about how human life is fragile, precious, and beautiful, and how we so easily stomp and crush it. Now, I do want to include a few slides from my cohort, Erica Lewis, again, because some of the examples that they brought to the table were just way too cool for me to pass up. So these are all contemporary photography artists. This one is Wendy Red Star. She is an indigenous Asaluki, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but it means crow, sculptor, a fiber artist, a performer, a photographer, and a videographer. And she makes work focusing on her heritage and challenging stereotypical imagery. So I really like this sort of like inflatable animal behind her and all of these fake ideas and stereotypes surrounded by a completely ruined landscape that we have ruined ourselves. I don't know, I just think it's quite poignant. Now, this next artist, or photographer and artist, is Amber Quinn. She is an American photographer who focuses on personal identity, the history of race in America, and the invisibility of struggles faced by modern Black Americans. And she utilizes both models and herself in these images. So she's talking about her own story, but also uplifting the voices of others, or allowing others to uplift her story through modeling for her. Also, as an art history nerd, I love Yasuo Morimura. This is a Japanese photographer who very clearly references art history. On the left here, it's a reference to an Albrecht Dürer print. Remember him? Yeah. And then on the right, this is a reference to a very famous reclining nude, the Venus of Urbino. And in it, he confronts the Western art history canon by staging himself within it because he sits outside of it as an Asian and also as a queer man. And he conceptually deals with personal and national identity, culture, and politics. So he's really taking these famous images and flipping them on their heads and inserting himself into a history that he's been excluded from. And adding so much interesting commentary. Later in this class, when we talk about Venus of Urbino, I'll bring this back up because it's just so good. Anyway, now, last but not least, I just wanted to talk a bit about the digital revolution, and that is basically Photoshop. Also, just the stopping of using film in general. So the use of a chemical photographic negative is beginning to go out of style. And instead, we're translating information directly from the lens to digital files. And because they're digital files, they can be altered easily through photo manipulation software. So this whole idea of photography being this vehicle of truth where the camera cannot lie no longer holds. The camera quite literally can lie now, or at least the person behind Photoshop at their computer. And in this way, also the specialness of photographs has kind of been reduced. There's not like this kind of magical air of romanticizing the film itself. So here's an example of a photo that doesn't look like it's been manipulated, but it has been highly manipulated. This is by Jeff Wall, and he creates these vividly real-looking, yet very much staged photographs. He blows them up to maximum size. This one is 8 feet by 10 feet. This one is called Boy Falls from Tree, and it seems documentary, like it really happened, but actually this is a combination of images carefully photoshopped over each other and together to look like a real photo so that you wouldn't be able to tell, at least with the naked eye. Now, with this in mind, I'd actually like to talk about a local artist that does work with this that I find super interesting, and we're lucky to have him here in Louisville. I mean, he worked in New York for a while and in different states, and actually his wife teaches here, but this is Josh Azzarella. And his wife is Tiffany Calvert. She teaches painting here. She's brilliant as well. But Josh Azzarella is local to Louisville, and he uses photo editing software to seamlessly remove victims from famous images of horrific violence, such as in these photographs of the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, in which American soldiers abused, tortured, and murdered detainees. Now, these original photographs, they took the world by storm. You can look them up at your own risk. I mean, I think everyone should see, the horrors of what we have done, but it is upsetting content, so that's why I'm not showing it here. But you could just Google Guantanamo Bay detention camp and find it super easily. If you haven't already seen it, probably a lot of you have already seen this. At least I would hope, because this is really important stuff to remember that we did. Anyway, the original photographs were absolutely horrific, but the essence of the horror is still there after Azzarella redacts the victims from the scene. And one thing that I would really like for us to discuss in class is, what does it mean to remove these victims? What is he saying with these images? Some people find it problematic. Some people find it to be a very important thing to be saying about the erasure of victims, or I don't know. I don't want to give you guys too many clues. I want to hear what you guys have to think about it. So have some thoughts about that. Maybe write them down, and we will definitely be talking about this in class. This one ended up not being as long as one of the other lectures. So thanks for sticking with me. I'll see you guys in class, and have a good one.